Arrogantly, they ask, why don't women know their place? Assertively, their better halves respond, for the same reason that men don't know their history. Your first country was a woman. So respect my wings. When will my red-stained wounds be reason enough to free me? Contraction, my bones crushed under the weight of your stares, your looks, your questions, shame. This same body you demonize is the same one you ate through, the same one you breathed from, the same one you grew in. Since when did your exit from a woman's body make you forget your exit from a woman's body? Don't you ever try and X out a woman and fix your tongue to disrespect the chromosome that made you, the belly that held you, the bones that spread for you. Inhale appreciation, hold your ignorance, and exhale her throne. The name of the piece I just performed is titled Release and was inspired by poet Nayyirah Waheed. It is without any embarrassment that I confess that the hardest part about being a writer for me is naming the pieces that I create. So initially, I attributed this to apathy. Perhaps I just didn't care enough about titles in order to put as much effort into them. And by now, you're all probably silently judging me for being that student that saves all of her documents under random numbers and letters. And you're right, because Cordy 2009 happens to be my favorite. But somewhere down the line, I began to realize that that wasn't exactly the case. At all, actually. The fact of the matter was that more than being a poet or a writer or someone who just enjoys writing blogs, I am rather, a documenter. An African, Black, Muslim woman who documents her experiences, thoughts, and feelings the best way she knows how, creatively. So upon realizing this, I made a very important promise to myself. I promised myself that I would begin to title my documentation with the very first thing that came to mind. That very first raw word, phrase, analogy, or metaphor that may not have made the most sense to the readers of my poetry or the listeners of my spoken word, but was nonetheless my reality. So how exactly did I come about naming a piece that conveys me as an angry feminist release? At first, the answer may present itself as pretty obvious or straightforward. Deeper than that, though, it was in this piece that for the absolute first time in my life that I openly documented about an experience that I had always felt forbidden from doing so. One of the past, present, and future of not only myself, but just about every single woman to have ever walked the face of the earth. Periods, professionally referred to as menstruation. The lovely gift sometimes visits when least expected, and other times on the exact day that the calendar or period tracker said it would. I know, it's witchcraft. According to the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the average period lasts anywhere between 3 to 5 days. Common symptoms include things like pain, cramps, hormonal changes, and not to be forgotten, bleeding. Now, I'm aware that my talk may have literally just gone from 0 to 100 real quick. But in my defense, the experience that I'm talking about is not one that is shared by everyone in the audience. So I have been convinced that it is only fair for me to lay out these FAQs. But more importantly, that information will deem itself relevant as I delve into the topic of my talk today, which is the lack of feminine hygiene products provided to female inmates in Michigan State prisons. But before I do any of that, let's take a few steps back. My name is Nabintou Doumbia, and I am the child of 2 Ivorian born and raised travelers. So, growing up in what I comfortably describe as the traditional African household, despite the negative connotation that the T word holds today, certain topics were just off limits. Meaning, you didn't talk about them as openly and confidently over rice for dinner with your family, which might I please just add just every single night. And usually this arose out of the fear of being defined or labeled shameless. So when these topics were ever brought up for discussion, they usually happened on a very low-key scale and were extremely personal. What was more interesting, though, was the fact that no one ever had to sit with you and go over the topics that were on that list. We were pretty much raised around knowing exactly what they were. So in other words, we were socialized to know. And conveniently enough, if you haven't guessed it already, menstruation made an appearance on that list. So me being the firm believer in the power of reflection that I am, it didn't take too long for me to become extremely interested in what labeling such topics as off-limits is doing to myself and my peers, but specifically young girls. So that reflection eventually resulted in much community conversation, a few debates here and there, and overwhelmingly, a lot more documentation. And what I came to gather was that the period shaming that we were encountering was doing something extremely dangerous, right? It was something much more dangerous than myself, much greater than myself, and even much greater than all of the girls that I conversed with. So with that further heightened sense of curiosity, that eventually transitioned into research, because I became convinced that this was problematic on a societal scale. My concern, or hypothesis, if you will, was that the period shaming that we were encountering could have very well been the birthplace of intolerance. So intolerance that looks like men assuming and having the utmost audacity to ask women whether or not it's that time of the month, anytime we, God forbid, display any emotion other than happiness. Intolerance that also looks like old, white men sitting on Capitol Hill and adding an additional tax to tampons because by their definition, the products needed to manage monthly periods are not necessity, they're luxury. So let's talk a little bit more about that latter intolerance in particular. This is, in fact, the same intolerance that strips female inmates of their basic human right, that being the right to be protected of public humiliation and the right to own just some measure of dignity. But of course, this argument of basic human right is one that some may not necessarily agree with. I mean, some of you could be sitting in this audience right now. And there's no need to get all tense because I'm not going to ask something controversial like, please raise your hand if you don't think that feminine hygiene products are a basic human right. And no, not because I'm naive and I think that no one would raise their hand, but because I'm aware that we have unrealistic societal standards for women and male privilege to think for the fact that not everyone would necessarily agree with such a statement. So let's take a few steps back in order to defend that argument. But before we do that, it's important that we know and understand some of the jargon surrounding the issue. So let's begin by discussing what exactly feminine hygiene products are. I'm going to go over three of the main ones. So first, we have one of the most commonly used and well-known items, which is a sanitary napkin, also referred to as a pad. Next, and just as infamous, is a tampon, and lastly, menstrual cups. So unfortunately, time does not grant me the privilege of getting into the details and the mechanics of each product, but fortunately enough, for those of us who are not familiar, aka all the men in the room, the internet is at your disposal. What I'm more interested in delving into, though, is the result of not having such products available. So something that's referred to as free bleeding becomes a woman's sole resort. Except that's actually incorrect because free bleeding, by definition, refers to a menstruating woman making the decision to abstain from the use of any sanitary products. So the ability to choose only arises after a presentation of options has actually occurred. So by that logic and by that definition, what we're discussing is not necessarily free bleeding, but forced bleeding. And at first, that might sound a bit extreme, but in 2014, the ACLU in Michigan represented 8 inmates of the Muskegon County Jail in a lawsuit based on denied access to feminine products. The matter escalated to such an extent to where the women attested to having witnessed fellow cellmates bleed through their clothes. So as if women aren't exploited enough within our society and prisoners aren't exploited enough, picture the two joining forces. What exactly are you left with? According to ex-inmate Chandra Bazelko, who served a near 6-year sentence in a state prison, you're left with exactly 5 pads per week per 2 cellmates. In an article that she uses to document her prison experiences, Bazelko writes that the limited distribution only allows for 1 change per day and an average 5-day monthly cycle. Yet, the Department of Health and Human Services strongly recommend that women change their pads before they become soaked in blood. So the math, or lack thereof, defends itself, right? The strategy makes absolutely no sense. But that's exactly what it is. It's a strategy. And I'd like to push this thinking thinking further by arguing that this particular strategy is called social marginalization, or the process through which we limit a person or group's social standing. But more than just being your average inmate, the protagonists in this situation are women, individuals belonging to one of society's most marginalized groups of all time. Women's bodies have been used as the caravans for enforcing war strategies. Their statuses are lowered to rest the egos of men, and even today, they are punished and humiliated for the same biological functions that birthed humanity itself. So to all of the men squirming in their seats right now, you'll be fine. Your male privilege has been checked a little bit, but that's okay. To continue though, we now have all this information about yet another injustice occurring in the world, and we're probably trying to figure out how exactly we fit in. How does this apply to me if I'm not a woman? Or if I'm a college student and nowhere near an activist ready to propose and implement solutions for fixing the issue? And maybe even I'm a professor or an instructor in a specific discipline, and I can't quite find the connection between what you're talking about, Nabintou, and my specialty. So to myself, first and foremost, and all of you guys thinking any of the things that I just mentioned, or maybe something completely different, I would just like to say that we are all on the same exact boat. So my interest in the lack of feminine hygiene products provided to female inmates came about out of curiosity. That eventually manifested itself into passion and research, and at this point, not too far from where I started, I have promised to involve myself in conversation. But for some, talking isn't enough, because action is a prerequisite to change. And while I do agree with that, I also understand that empowering discussions and raw conversation tend to be the birthplace for such change to happen. As long as people like you and me remain ignorant to this injustice that's literally happening right in our backyards, we make it even more difficult for ourselves and others to stand up together and act. For those reasons, conversations and discussions in their rawest and most powerful forms are in fact action. So I leave you all with that. I challenge my fellow college students to take this conversation outside of this room into your social groups, sociology classrooms, and even through the doors of your homes. I challenge respected professors and instructors to encourage such conversation within the power structures known as your classroom, where you all hold tremendous influence. But more than any of that, I challenge myself first and foremost, and every single one of us sitting in this room, I challenge us all to care. Thank you so much.